I think we kick it off. So hello everybody and welcome to this SuDS Pillar Talk on SuDS and amenity. And before we get started, I just wanted to really thank our partners and supporters. Like most projects, SuDS is funded by our supporters and partners. So this is really a thank you to those people who helped us take things forward, and also to recognize the support. Without their support, this wouldn't happen. So Illman Young, who is being represented by Sue, is also a partner, a supporter for susdrain. So if you want to find a bit more about the susdrain work, you'll be able to find that on our website, and please do get in touch if you would like to get involved. So I'm Paul Schaffer. I coordinate SuDS's work on blue-green infrastructure. That includes SuDS and susdrain. And if you haven't come across susdrain before, susdrain is a project that's been developed to share good practice on SuDS with the hope to inspire, inform and influence SuDS delivery. This webcast is the third of 4 webcasts covering the SuDS pillars. And the SuDS pillars are really what we're using to set the high-level objectives and benefits for SuDS. So these being managing the quantity and quality of runoff, creating better places for people, which is amenity, and also creating better places for nature. And we're covering each of these pillars in 4 webcasts, and during that time I've been joined by experts for each of the SuDS pillars. So they will share their thoughts on the opportunities, the challenges, and also an overview of the practice in terms of delivering SuDS to meet some of those requirements or deliver those pillars. And we also have an opportunity to answer your questions. So today's webcast, as I said before, is looking at amenity, and I think there's probably a common perception for a while that the likes of water quality, amenity and biodiversity are really playing second fiddle to those requirements related to water quantity. However, I think if we look to our neighbours in Wales and we look elsewhere, there is growing emphasis of the need to deliver amenity as part of an approach that delivers multiple benefits. And I think the number of drivers for delivering multiple benefits and amenity are continuing to increase. And I think we'll be discussing that in a bit more detail later on. So it's time for the first of our 2 polls. So it's a simple one, is what role do you have in SuDS delivery? This is either approval, practitioner, designer, developer and client, or other. And as you can see, the greatest proportion of you are practitioners and designers. So if we can go on to our second poll straight away, is how would you describe your professional role? Are you civil, drainage or structural engineer, highways engineer, architect, landscape professional, ecologist or other? Gotta say, you're pretty quick off the mark. We've got 70% of you voted already. So I will end the polling there. Brilliant. Okay, so the large majority of you, 54%, are civil, drainage or structural engineers. That's really helpful. That's really great. And we'll consider that as we go through the presentation. So for today's webcast on amenity, I'm delighted to say that I've been joined by Sue Illman, who is Managing Director at Illman Young Landscape Design. So Sue's a past president of the Landscape Institute and a construction industry council champion for flood mitigation and resilience. Sue's been championing SuDS for a number of years, being a co-author of the SuDS manual and the SuDS construction guide. She's a SuDS trainer for Syria and also for our initiative that we're delivering with CIREM on training water companies and their partners on SuDS as part of the design and construction guidance. And Sue's also a team advising, part of a team advising DEFRA on possible updates to the non-statutory technical standard for SuDS, with a view to looking to see how we can incorporate multiple benefits. So the webcast is pretty simple. Sue will have an opportunity to give an overview of SuDS and amenity, explaining what works, what doesn't, and what she might like to see change. And also, we will then have an opportunity to answer some of your questions. So please do raise questions, otherwise it would just be me posing some difficult questions to Sue. So I think she'd much rather prefer to answer your questions than deal with mine. So, and what we intend to do is within the next hour, we will be able to give you an overview, answer your questions, and then we will send you on your way. So I will now pass over control to Sue. And Sue, you should be able to have control now.
Right, hope it works. Yes, success. We've got it right. We're off to a good start. Well, welcome everybody, and really pleasing to see that so many of you are my engineering colleagues. I've got a little saying. I always think that landscape and engineering, I always call that a civil partnership. So we're going to be very civil today, and be nice to talk about amenity for a change. So as Paul said, amenity has always been one of the 4 pillars of SuDS, but I suppose perhaps a little bit of misunderstanding perhaps about what amenity means. Just a sort of dictionary definition. This actually comes from the planning portal. So amenity describes the character or enjoyment of a landscape and how the relationship of its features contribute to that experience. So it's a fairly broad-ranging definition, and it also talks about landscape. And I suppose the thing I should say is that landscape for us as landscape professionals means pretty much everywhere. We're not talking about countryside necessarily. We're equally talking about the streetscape or the urban landscape. So it's about the sense of place that we create wherever we're designing and creating development and the landscape around it, whatever that is. And from the point of view of SuDS, to see how we can integrate amenity in each of those developments on the basis every time we develop, we actually have to address the issue of what is going to happen with the surface waters that's generated out of that development. So this, I think, is very much now on the agenda, considering where we are today. You know, so much has happened in this last year, and I'm not just talking COVID, although I will come back to that, as you will see from this slide. Because this is about what's happening in government and has been happening for a number of years, and it's a direction of travel that we're moving in. So looking at the 25-year environment plan, what that's now seeking to embrace in the way that we consider development and our landscapes, what's coming through the planning white paper in particular, as to what that is actually saying as to how we're going to approach development in all of its different forms, and how we are going to really embrace these issues of climate change and the environment and the ramifications for that. And possibly, you know, the wrong order here on this slide, because the Living with Beauty report that's come through from the Building Beautiful, Building Better Commission. When I first heard about what they were doing, I was really skeptical as to what it might achieve, but it's quite extraordinary that the outcomes from that report are now pervading government guidance in the way that they are. To say that, so if we are going to build back, we not only must we build back better, but that we must build back beautiful, and how that plays out throughout guidance at all levels. So there is this huge movement of change. I mean, we know it's coming just because of what's happening through the planning white paper and the structures that have been put in place. And clearly there's now this massive area of work that's going on, seeking to see how we're going to actually deliver that through the, you know, the national model design codes, and then down through the need for these local design codes. And how's that going to affect us with SuDS? Where does the non-statutory technical standards sit within that? How is that also going to be brought back into that whole planning environment to look at how we actually shape the future development? So, you know, massive amount of change there, lots of opportunities, and really the hope that we can grasp all of those, and through the work that we're all doing, actually make the deliverability of this so much better than perhaps we've done in the past in what we do with SuDS and how that's realised, and development in general. At the same time, the other considerations, well, the update for Manual for Streets to me is an absolutely key one. When 1 and 2 both came out, You know, SuDS got a mention in passing, but nothing in particular, and everybody's still going back to old design bulletins for certain sorts of things. But there is this absolute need to embrace the fact of actually the way we integrate SuDS within our streets and our highways. It's the one big missed opportunity, and it really shapes development at the moment in a way that I think is not appropriate. Some local authorities have really embraced it, but nowhere near enough. And I think this update is a real potential for change. So I think that's really a very exciting possibility. And certainly with Syria and others, you know, we are seeking to be involved with CIHT to actually see how we can talk about this and how it can be done. And I absolutely can't miss COVID, because I think that what it's done for the whole country is to make them realise how important the spaces around where they live are. The need for us to actually address that in terms of what we do with development, that we must have healthy, attractive places for people to use. It's brought it home, I think, nationally as to how important our open spaces are. So can those changes actually drive better SuDS design? And I suppose, why is there such a lack of good practice in providing amenity in SuDS design? Because, you know, when you look at what's being delivered on the ground now, it really is, so much of it is just not what it should be. And so, you know, a series of questions for you all. Is it that the wrong people are designing these spaces? And I think it probably is, because where we're integrating SuDS into development and we're putting it into public open space in the main, you know, the classic pipe to pond system, the thought about what that feature might be and how it's going to be designed and how it's going to be used by those people and how it's going to contribute to not just its space and its character and its biodiversity and all these other things. I don't think there's any thought much about that at all. Is it that we've got uninformed clients who don't appreciate the value that SuDS can bring when you integrate it properly in the design, not just down at this dreaded pond at the end, but the way we can actually allow it to inform that streetscape, how we can make it enrich that environment? Because the point about that is that we can, you know, we can assist in the way that developments are perceived in terms of making them more attractive to those who wish to buy them and to the people that wish to live there, and create those healthy environments that people are talking about. The approvers, they see a scheme that's showing a piece of public open space and it's got a pond in it. Well, that can't be bad. That's got to be a nice feature, surely, but not if it is of, you know, of no great value to people by being fenced off with, you know, rubber rings in case you fall into this occasional bit of water and drown, unsightly head walls, you know, steep banks, no decent planting, not well managed, something that actually nobody in particular would like to have on their doorstep, as opposed to something attractive. Or the process, is it just that we don't have this process right? And I think it's all of those perhaps. And we do see it, you know, particularly where you get large schemes where these perhaps are the ones that suffer the most. If you've got a fairly straightforward scheme where you've got a series of houses and they're going to be built in a sequence, and that scheme is being developed, the scenario I'm just going to talk to you about possibly won't occur so much. But on bigger schemes, you know, what we get through coming through planning in the main can be really quite inadequate these days. So, you know, that isn't very helpful. So is our SuDS scheme actually drawn, or is ours something of a concept that's described in the design and access statement and is mentioned in the SuDS report, or is it something that has really been thought about and illustrated properly in that application? Well, it's outlined, so it's a concept, and so it will change in the details. So it's talked about, it's fine. We get to reserve matters, and what we see is what might have been talked about is now diminished as it's fitted into how it's going to be in that particular layout. Maybe by the time we get to the conditions, that's been reduced again once we started to look at the working working drawings and how it's all actually going to really happen and be built, and they hadn't thought about the levels properly and they hadn't worked out how it might all fit together. And then we're starting to do those parcels and we're getting minor amendments where that scheme is starting to be decimated, and all of a sudden the tanks are creeping in and everything else is going pear-shaped. And then when we look at phasing of things, really the whole essence of what might have been there at the beginning is abandoned. And that is a sorry tale to tell, and it is one that is not uncommon. Perhaps that might be a slightly extreme version of that, but I promise you that is happening throughout the country. It doesn't have to be like that, and it shouldn't be like that, because actually working with amenity should be the one that adds the icing on the cake, and not isn't the thing that's left to the right to the end. So I think the point about it is, why do we want to do it? Because clearly there's the visual aspect and that definition of amenity about actually creating places that have character, that is meaningful and value to people. But actually, if we're going to integrate amenity, and I suppose in a way I'm going to talk much more about planting in that respect, they deliver so many other benefits. And what we will get is things like environments that are resilient to climate change. We're going to have healthier environments with cleaner air and water. And we're certainly going to have more biodiverse habitats. And that's actually not forgetting some of the other issues in terms of the definition of SuDS, is the fact that if we're going to do this, we're going to add those other benefits about the ability to reuse water, with raw water being a much more precious and scarce resource, you know, in general. The fact that, you know, amenities, just by having that space, we can actually allow it to provide other amenities for developments in general. And also the fact that water in itself has its own amenity value. The sound of it, the movement of it, the light shining on it adds quality to these spaces. They're all part of that description of amenity. And the point for me is, if we can maximize those benefits in the way that we design and develop sites, then really, why wouldn't we want to do it? Yeah, I seem to be having trouble with getting this to move on, Paul. I
can
don't know
do it, no
if
problem.
you can.
Yeah.
Right, okay, sorry about that. So really, water management, it's for a healthy environment, and it's really just the two principles. It's a healthy environment that supports the water environment, and it supports people, and it supports biodiversity. And then there's the other side, the water cycle considerations, that we have to do that throughout the planning, design and delivery process to maximize those benefits. So it's two sides. We've got to think about all of those things, and we've got to ensure that, having had that vision at the initial concept, that we take it through that process and make sure that we actually do achieve what it was that we set out to do when we started. And I think a lot of these problems is because there's not that conviction that there is something that's that positive that we want to achieve as the end game, that it gets lost along the way because there's not somebody there shouting and screaming and saying, we must have that. You know, if we were talking about the number of parking spaces outside houses, you'd shout much more if we took them all away at the end. But where it's something that's so much more tenuous, it can easily get lost in the process and not, you know, the value of it not recognized. And if you don't see it often enough, then actually you're not going to know that this is something that you're missing in terms of its potential. Because this is about not just creating development, this is about creating places for people to live and enjoy, because it's all about designing for people, because that's who is going to enjoy it at the end. And as I said, through COVID, I think we've really learned to value our open spaces, and particularly in the urban environment. Those places for people to escape. There is that ability to connect with nature. All the people posting about watching birds and watching things grow. The ability to have spaces there to actually meet friends or family, as long as you're in safe numbers and there's not too many of you. But you can walk and talk, and we can be in the open air. And for children that need to have space to run, play, or just be, to play with water, places to think. But we should be making places that also are beautiful, because there is no reason why functionality can't be attractive, and space to breathe. And, you know, we have a real contribution to make through the use of vegetation, and particularly towards trees in that respect. But while we're delivering amenity, then actually it is this multifunctional tool. And so we must appreciate that this, what it delivers here, nothing else can do in the same way. So hopefully you'll all appreciate the concept of interception. And that's about dealing with what we call everyday rainfall, so up to 5 millimeters of rain. So yes, it can collect on tarmac surfaces, but that's not going to do very much. The ability of a tree of any scale and the ability of planting to actually hold that water, and therefore to hold it in the soil so that it never enters our drainage system, is a really important thing. And it's phenomenal the amount that a mature tree with all of its leaves can actually hold back. Just think about it. If it rains and you stand under one, you don't get wet for really a significant amount of time. That's what interception's doing for you. And then those plants will take up that water, again, keeping it out of those drainage systems. It can help to manage particulates by, again, it's holding it on its leaves, and then they're safely washed down into the systems. And the shading effect of trees can reduce the urban heat island effect. We all understand that. And it's not just that, because obviously green roofs are going to do the same thing. They're certainly important in terms of urban cooling. We can reduce pollutants in surface water, because plants through their root systems have a huge amount of value in terms of capturing those. And in fact, they metabolize hydrocarbons. So wet-dry systems, things like swales that dry out and then get wet again, that function metabolizes hydrocarbons. And then we get to the biodiversity side, that we're going to get these species networks, we're going to be planting many more things, and we create these linear migration pathways as well, which are considered to be extremely important, increasingly important these days. And obviously, when you're providing such a wide range of diverse habitats, then you've got that opportunity to enhance biodiversity in a really wide range of ways. So, you know, those multifunctional benefits are real ones, and they can only be delivered if you're going to do all of these things. Now, I know ordinary planting can do that, but we have this necessity to manage water. So combining those two by designing them together is just about maximizing value. And how we do that is really, we can make beautiful places everywhere, and it is absolutely regardless of size. And all it is about is designing at a scale that's appropriate to both the SuDS that you need to deliver and the setting in which you're delivering it. So it doesn't matter whether it's the urban landscape, it's a streetscape or public open space, whether it's a big park, whether it's just a small incidental feature. All of these things can just assist in terms of their collective delivery. So then it's about understanding how people wish or could use a space, how you're going to design it, to create something that's appropriate to the local character of the place and to the local character of the people as well. And to think about what sorts of facilities it might be appropriate to put in there. Is it about seating? Is it about activities? Is it about quiet space? Is it about designing things for play, whether that play is incidental or whether it's specifically provided? But more importantly, opportunities for social interaction between people. And again, I cite our recent experience. And then, of course, we can have interactive spaces. SuDS can be interactive, and we can have public art. SuDS can be part of that public art, and there are some beautiful examples around. So it's about, we are only limited by our imagination in what we do in terms of providing that variety of space, but a safe space for people to enjoy. And definitely things need to change. We need to get a greater understanding of what's possible and aspire to deliver it. So clients might need a better understanding of what SuDS can achieve through their design integration within systems. People need to understand that beautiful places, beyond a doubt, add value and add quality. You know, the mantra, and it's well researched now, that the SuDS that are located close to housing, those houses sell more quickly and sell for higher values. Surely that's a great way to educate clients about that, and indeed us all. And it's not about, you know, I see too many external space integrating SuDS, which is just about ease of modeling. Let's have some nice 1 in 3 slopes because that's the maximum gradient we can safely have. No, it isn't. That's not what it's all about. You know, just because you can quantify it in micro drainage doesn't mean to say it's good design and it's going to have amenity. You know, that for me is an abomination of an approach in terms of what we're doing, because you don't have to push it that much more to make something really good. Space is just precious, you know, particularly in the urban environment, and to waste it is criminal when you could do it better. So water management as the driver, but also it's quality of design and absolutely quality of construction, absolutely key to get it right, because the devil's in the detail, and if you don't get it right, you won't pull it off and deliver what it is we all aspire to. And to do that, it absolutely must be a genuine team approach where we each respect each other in what we do and we work together to deliver what the public require of us. So there are easily beautiful places that can be created, whether it's retrofit or new build is the big one, because in retrofit we're making positive decisions for change, knowing we want to improve that environment whilst we're managing surface water. New build is the one that we're really struggling with. So thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Sue. And I like the pun about civil partnership. So it's a good one. So we've got some questions. There's still some time to vote for those and add some more. But while you're thinking, there's also time for our third poll. So this is, to what extent does the concept of amenity in relation to SuDS have a bearing on the work that you do? So is it a major influence, a key consideration, something we think about as one factor in the mix, a minor consideration overall, or we'll leave it to other members of the team?
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah, it's a bit of a
Real
split
mix.
there, isn't it?
Yeah,
Isn't
real
it? So,
mix.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I will stop the polling there and I will share the results. Right, so as you can see, it's not much in it, but something we think about as one factor in the mix just edged it really, and then it's closely followed by a key consideration. So,
Good.
yeah, no, so thank you for that. That was really helpful. So now we move on to the questions, and we've had a few come through, and we'll just try and see what the most popular one. Okay, so that's interesting. There's a few questions in there that were some of the things I wanted to ask, but the most popular one is related to public open space. So this is from Hannah Perkis, and Hannah, thank you for the question. I'm not quite sure whether we're better to provide that many examples off the top of our head, but can you provide examples of sorry, I just got the poll come up. Can you provide examples of sites where open SuDS have been successfully incorporated in public open space that we as approvers can provide developers as an example to encourage them to replicate it within their sites? So yeah, it's difficult to know whether they've been some of the sites that we know of, so I suppose, have been designated as public open space by the local planning authorities, but there's a number of sites that I know that do have public open space that is, well, open space that is utilised for flood management.
Yeah, I mean, the Enfield team have been doing quite a bit of that, haven't they, Paul? But then that's more in terms of retrofit, but I think they are working through the planning system. Cambridge as an authority have certainly been very proactive in what they're doing. John Rumble's lot are also very proactive What's
Yeah,
his authority? Sorry, my brain's gone
Hertfordshire.
completely.
So
Yeah,
Hertfordshire, but
Hertfordshire.
there's also been a really good example in the Manor Farm in Sheffield, which is a susdrain case study where
Yeah,
they have actively used public open space, whether it's been designated as public open space by a local planning authority, but they've used that as flood control, flood management areas. And there's a few others out there. I don't know, it's which have done that. It's difficult to, I think, probably needs to be an element of drilling down into some of the case studies that are on susdrain to see whether
yeah.
the planners have agreed for the public open space to be utilised as SuDS, but there are a number of schemes out there that have got detention basins and areas that are designed to flood in large rainfall events.
Yeah, I know there are some areas, I think is it around Theale, so out west of London. Oh, blimey, off the top of my head, my brain has gone completely blank. But we definitely are seeing it. And I think particularly with some of the big housing developers, you are seeing it. We're not always seeing it as well integrated as it could be. But I think there are definitely some good examples. But certainly Hertfordshire is a good example as an authority. Cambridge have definitely done good work, and particularly around the universities. Now I know that sort of it is public open space, albeit it's sort of within the holdings of the outer reaches of the university. It's treated as public open space almost. So yes, there are. It's slow, but in Cambridgeshire generally, I know there are some good housing developments there. Some of the work of Homes England, you know, they've got some good sites where, but how extensive that open space is, I couldn't actually say. I've certainly seen with the major developers some big master planning approaches. I haven't seen them on the ground to see how good they are. I know I have seen drawings for some where it's a series of bomb crater ponds connected together, which has very little to do with amenity. And there were no good for anybody who wasn't seeing the slides, but certainly there is a whole collection of the ghastly bomb craters which have very little to do with anything, and it really is just that end of pipe solution with not much thought to it. But the good examples are getting better and more extensive, and I think the problem we've got is the time scale from the early planning through to delivery on site. But I think we are building up something of a head of steam. But I have to say that on the small local development scales, we're building up a head of scheme of very poor schemes.
Great. Well, thank you for that question. So we've got and that answer, Sue. We've got another question that's just pipped in. So this is a question from Chloe Spencer, and I know this is an area that we've discussed a few times. Is a lot of our clients, I'm assuming they're developers, come to us with pre-agreed layouts, having spent a lot of time talking to the architects, and do not wish to change these to allow for drainage. Is there much work being done to try and engage with architects to help them understand the importance of allowing space for SuDS features?
Yes. I mean, I think you have to just work with your architects and work with your client teams, and go and do presentation to your developer clients and actually show them how it could be so much better. And it doesn't require more space, it just requires more thought. I agree, it's difficult. If you're working more on the periphery, if you are a landscape architect and therefore you're involved in the landscape and visual impact assessment, then you have much more clout because you're helping to shape the form of the development. So we try to work with developers where we can be in very early on and start to look at how we're shaping the spatial arrangements of the development as a whole, also understanding the topography and the views to see how we can then integrate it. But very difficult if you're presented with a fixed layout, because you get very little wriggle room to do anything, and then you're really just adding in a bit of twiddly-dee plot landscape and a few trees in a corner if you're lucky, and it becomes meaningless in that respect. But then they're not going to be in the main delivering SuDS in the form that we're talking about. And I think you know, if we are going to go down this route that's being outlined in the planning white paper, if we can get local design codes, if those embrace this concept, and if the changes that are coming, there's a lot of ifs here in the non-statutory technical standards, which will put perhaps greater emphasis on these aspects of water quality, amenity and biodiversity, and you have to demonstrate that your compliance with that, then those layouts will have to change, beyond a doubt.
There seems to be a perfect storm brewing in terms of the opportunities to get multiple benefits. And I suppose as a group of practitioners and maybe those people trying to champion good practice, we probably need to make sure that we're making the most of our voices, to make sure that we are using those consultations, whether it be related to the planning white paper or I suspect manual for streets, we're coming out to make sure that that holy trinity of planning, SuDS and probably highways actually comes together and we get the outcomes that we wanted. There's another question coming through, which is, I think is very much related, and it's from Lee. And the question is, larger developments often think that the implementation of SuDS takes away from plot volumes they can include, and often think that SuDS cannot be integrated with landscaping. How can the view on this be changed? And I think it comes back to some of the things you were saying before, but is there anything specific that you think that we can try and help change that perception about SuDS's land take?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point is, if you can integrate it properly within your open space, then you can count it in open space. But the problem that we've had is people have seen that as an ability to manage your drainage supposedly on the surface, but then there's no beneficial use or quality in that space. So we then got to a point where people don't want to, they see it as an addition to public open space, as a part, as opposed to a part of public open space. So it may be that it also is dependent on the scale of that space. I mean, obviously your question is about space in general, but as there is a requirement to provide public open space with any decent sized development, you know, it is a requirement. If moving forward, you know, the Building Beautiful, Building Better Commission recommendations, you know, one of which is tree-lined streets. Well, for me, that's tree-lined streets with grass verges and swales, and the SuDS are already there. So once we get over the hurdle of making sure that highways are comfortable with those sorts of arrangements, then actually, you know, and most decent sized developments will have tree-lined streets. So why aren't you integrating them there and just managing your services so that you can do so? So I think, you know, you have to find the opportunities, but the point is you need to find the opportunities to be able to design in the way that you might normally do so, but integrate your SuDS at the same time, but not in a way that the SuDS precludes the use by people, because otherwise that's just a sort of steal. I've sort of gone sideways off your question there, I'm quite conscious of. So pull me back again.
I think what your answer probably presented, Sue, is the fact that it is actually really quite complex, and there's an awful lot of different factors driving decisions. And as much as we think drainage is important, we haven't yet necessarily managed to convince some architects and master planners that it's something that needs to be considered earlier on, because it's not, you can't really necessarily fight with gravity in terms of flow routes and so forth, and that layout developments could and should be maybe influenced by water flows and flow rates, and where depressions are, to make sure that the water's been managed and stored in the right places.
Yeah, but we don't have to do it. We don't have to do it all through green systems. I mean, it is about having that holistic approach. So, you know, if you've got high density with flatted developments, then why aren't you doing green roofs? Why aren't you doing rainwater harvesting? If you've got courtyards, why aren't you doing permeable paving? You know, it is, you know, we can do SuDS tree pits. You know, there are many techniques to use, and it's about using the right technique in the right place. I think, and if you actually disperse the way that you manage your water and truly integrate it throughout the development, then you don't need an enormous great lump of space down the bottom to do it in, because you've actually managed it as it's supposed to be, close to where it falls. It shouldn't be, it should reach its first point of being managed as soon as possible to where it lands on the ground. So, think about that full range of tools that we have for managing water on the surface and see where you can integrate them. And yes, you do have to take a slightly different approach, but we know we can't do it everywhere. We could, but there are those spatial constraints. I totally accept that, but it requires you to have a slightly different mindset when you approach design, beyond a doubt.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for that. I think that kind of quite nicely, I'm going to take it out of popularity order and go to the next question related to this. Is from Simon Franks, and he says that he thinks there's confusion for small builders, single plot maybe, as to what's expected of them to and what's acceptable for the SAB for very small developments. I suppose it's, and he says, can some examples be given? I suspect he's asking for types of components that might be acceptable to a SAB on a small site. I'm not sure if Simon's from Wales or not. I don't know.
I'm assuming you're from Wales if you've got a SAB, because you're the only ones that have. Yeah, I think if you've got a very small development, then it might be that you possibly might just have a few corners in your plot where you that you can't really use because they're quite small. You are probably going to be looking at some rainwater harvesting, even if it is with water butts adjacent to properties, which can discharge into bioretention planters, which might be your little incidental bits of space that you happen to have in the corners of development. And you might just therefore need to go with your permeable paving, albeit I think in Wales they're not too keen on that as a measurement. So if that's the scenario, that really is quite difficult. But because and I totally understand that on very small plots there may not be much space to do this. I think all you can say is try to find the corners and maximize what you can do. And you can use water butts going into bioretention planters, and you can have water butts with draw down to halfway, so that they will actually at least deal with the small scale events and some of the slightly larger events. But clearly for anything that's prolonged, they're not going to be terribly effective, so you then have to have storage elsewhere. But I think it is also about thinking about the whole building, and if we can do rainwater harvesting, which I think in Wales they are addressing, and reusing it in the building, then you've really only got the hard surfaces to deal with. So that is where you could see how much of it you could make permeable, and how much of even from that you could take into and use your incidental spaces for bioretention.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I think from conversations I've had with SAB officers and RALs, there's quite a lot of diversity in terms of the approaches for delivering SUDs and small sites. Some SABs are happy to take on permeable paving as long as there's appropriate maintenance been undertaken, and some are also encouraging the use of bioretention planters and rain gardens as a measure that can be taken forward. So yeah, I think it's something that we need to keep a watching brief on in terms of how Wales are going forward with SUDs and smaller sites. So we're moving now on to a question from Dave Hughes, which is talking about with water companies beginning to adopt SUDs, what encouragement is being used to get them to consider amenity in the designs that they approve?
Oh, yes. Well, I'm doing loads of that because I'm one of the trainers. Yes, right in my sweet spot. Thank you very much indeed. Well, water companies are being trained very comprehensively about the whole concept of SUDs. And I have to say, I've been superbly impressed by the range of people that they're actually putting through these courses. So they really are embracing it, the ones that I've worked with so far, substantially. And one of the modules that I teach is actually an introduction to planning for water company people. And really what we're stressing is that encouraging them to really understand what SuDS are, the whole range of them, and how they could and should be integrated and designed as complete systems, and encouraging them, therefore, to understand what they should be, and then to engage much more actively with the planning process, so that they are involved from the outset at the pre-app with the developers, on the basis that if you want us to adopt your system, we need to be part of that process, to understand where you're coming from and to help encourage and shape what that's going to be. So we're encouraging them to be part of the pre-app process, to be part of the consultation. Clearly, the local authority would wish to know who is going to adopt, so having that involvement. And then we're encouraging them to have that ongoing involvement through its construction, on the basis that they need to know that what's being built is what they signed up to when they saw those drawings and how they were going to work, so that they've got certainty when they take it on that it's going to deliver what it's supposed to and that it's going to function as it's supposed to. So I think that we're very much still in the early days, and April was the starting point, but clearly that we've got to work through that process. So they're very conscious that they've not had as much the involvement. The issue of involvement is very variable, because obviously water companies have big areas that they work within, and they have dozens of local authorities that they're then working with as well. But they are very much now encouraged to embrace that whole thing from pre-app right through to completion on site, so that they can know that it's been signed off. They've got the drawings at completion that show how it works. They know it's got the capacity. They know it's going to function, and therefore they can adopt.
Yeah.
And that the proper management plans and maintenance plans are in place.
I think they've definitely been engaged and told what is good practice. I think there is still some differentiation about how some of the water companies are taking that forward. So
yeah.
I think it's a case of actually having, with all of this, because there's not really strong regulation with the teeth, I think it's about having those good, useful conversations as soon as possible. But they've definitely been told about the value and benefits of integration and how good outcomes can be achieved. So
yeah. Can I just say also, we are encouraging them to not only engage on major applications, but on minor ones as well, on the basis that if they do, they could be the only external consultee other than the internal planning team. So that's something also to bear in mind.
Yeah. So here's a good one, and I think the similar question came up when I was chatting with Bridget around water quantity, about who should take a lead role in delivering SuDS. So this has come from a friend, Peter Coombs. It says, question: SuDS need to be considered at the outset in conjunction with spatial planning, identifying blue-green corridors to ensure we utilise space. Who is really driving this and taking responsibility? Engineer, architect, landscape architect, or approver? I suppose there's two questions here. Who is driving this, and who do we think would like to or should be driving it?
Well, I think who's driving it is anybody's guess, really. Yeah. Different projects. I suppose, clearly, I'm going to say landscape architects, aren't I? It really depends on the site, how it happens, I would suggest. As I said, a lot of sites that we work on, where we're involved in the landscape and visual appraisal, we would do that initial work and take those findings to the design team as a sort of constraints and opportunities, and then work as a team. So I think that each professional leads on certain aspects of it at certain points in its development. Clearly you've got to understand the fact that water flows downhill by the fastest possible route, and so how you're going to collect it can be key. It really depends on the site. You've also got to be able to discharge it somewhere off a site. So actually understanding natural flow paths is pretty fundamental, no matter who's leading it. So, I can draw diagrams showing water going downhill as easily as you guys who are engineers, but somebody needs to do it. And the problem that you possibly get is that engineers, I think, are not brought in early enough to actually themselves have an influence in this process. So we work very closely with architects on the housing layouts, but we also want you who are engineers to be part of that process too. And I don't think, it tends to be historically that, because when water's just going in a pipe down the edge of a road, it doesn't matter if you don't come in till later, except for obviously there has to be discussions around discharge and understanding, volumes of flows and how it's managed. But now, and since we've had SuDS and trying to do things differently and the need to attenuate the different types of levels of storm events and flows, that's got to come, it's got to move further up the agenda and further towards the initial design concept. So actually, I'd like ourselves, the architects and the engineers, to sit down together because I think that master planning is absolutely a joint process and we all need to have our say and then get on with our bits and then come back together and see how it's developing. We can't all sit there holding a 6B pencil, but we can talk to each other and we can have, looked at those concepts, looked at topography, looked at views, looked at what's precious, looked at the biodiversity, looked at the resources, and come to conclusions that lead to good design.
Brilliant. And I think there is that element of respecting each other's disciplines and strengths.
Totally.
And I've heard stories of engineers going to landscape architects right at the end of the process and saying, make this look pretty. And likewise, I've heard landscape architects going to engineers saying, please do the numbers on this. So I think there's an understanding that there needs to be a bit more creative and mutual discussion going forward, maybe. So
I mean, to be absolutely honest, I've spent years being interested and involved in SuDS, and I will hold my hand up and say not every landscape architect has got that background. Of course they don't. And it's the same with you guys and the engineering. How many of you have actually worked closely with landscape professionals on doing this? We're all learning, and hopefully we're all happy to share that learning. And that's really the most important thing for me, is to have those discussions and share and learn together.
Great. I think we've got time for one last question, and I don't think we could do something on amenity and managing water on the surface without a question dealing with risk. So this question is actually the most popular one that's come through, and it's from Richard Catling. It says, how do you deal with risk-adverse clients trying to protect ponds and SuDS areas with fencing and railings? Is there some go-to guidance that you use to discourage this?
Yeah. Okay. Well, really go to the SuDS manual. So as part of writing the SuDS manual, I think it was you, Paul, wasn't it? Did a lot of consultations with ROSPA, Royal Society for the Prevention of Accidents, and it's very well documented within there, the design criteria that you need to consider. And the mantra is as safe as necessary, not as safe as possible. So it's, if you think about it, the majority of features that are on the surface are not likely to cause a problem. I think the chances of you drowning in a swale is fairly remote. Although, to be fair, I have seen plenty of pretty dangerous swales which are steep-sided and full of water a lot of the time. But just thinking about it rationally, about what we should be, it is the big water bodies where there's permanent water is the thing of greatest concern. So it's about the siting of those features, understanding who's going to access them and how that access is going to be. It's then about their containment, if that is what you choose to do, and there are places where that is appropriate, but you don't stick fencing just around the wet bits and with a big sign saying this is dangerous. It's about a much more complex consideration about people, their use of spaces, and then actually getting the design of that feature to be right and appropriate. So having deep water, steep sides, we need ponds particularly to be able to be accessible for people to maintain them. And there's this, partial understanding of what's been said about slopes at 1 in 3, as if just by doing that and it going down to 5 meters of water is safe. Well, not necessarily. So look at what it says about benching, access, maintenance, barrier planting, variety of gradients, location, fencing and safety. You can do it, and I think it's if you're respectful of those criteria and look at how it's done, then I think that most clients could be happy, because if you fill in the checklist relative to ROSPA and you can, you know, show that that due process has been followed, no one can be certain that everything that will be safe all of the time, but you can ensure that your design, and more importantly than that, its construction is as safe as is necessary for the environment in which you're going to put it. Look, we've just lost our connection with water. You know, it was always everywhere all the time. We're getting that back, and there's a huge pleasure in it if it's done nicely and done well. So, you know, don't let that be lost.
Great. Well, thank you for that answer, Sue, and thank you for the discussion and the chat. I think we could have easily gone on for a lot longer. There was 15 questions we haven't yet answered, and plenty of other things that we can discuss. So thank you for the answers, and thank you, everybody, for the questions.
Thank you. Yeah, been good to speak to you.
So we've got one last poll, and it's leading on from the discussion around integration. So Anifa, can you run the poll, please, if that's okay? Right. So this question is, to what extent do you take an integrated design approach to SuDS? So SuDS on the surface using a range of techniques are integrated through the design comprehensively, reintegrated where we can. The main SuDS features is generally a pond at the end of the system, and the majority of the system is below ground. So give it a few more minutes, or a few more seconds even. All right, so wait till at least half of you have voted. Great. Okay, so I'm going to end the polling there. And 43% of you are integrating it where we can, which is great news. So although there's 18% that say the majority of the system is below ground, but I think that is, I think as long as people are taking opportunities to integrate it where we can, that's brilliant. So marvelous. Okay, well,
thank you.
Thank you for that. So that brings us to a close, and I just want to thank Sue for the presentation and the discussion, and also the question. And I also probably need to thank our partners and supporters again. So I thank them for their support and enabling you guys to ask such great questions. So thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you.